Hi guys. Today we're going to look at how clothing GFX works in Crusader Kings 3. I've previously gone over ethnicities in another video and explained how the game set number of ethnicities that are used to generate what a character looks like, but that's only in terms of physical genetic traits. But part of what makes a big difference in how the characters appear is the styling. This is defined fully by culture. So is if a character converts to another culture, they're still going to appear like characters in the original ethnicity, but you have the ability to pass those genetic traits down. But when you adopt a new culture, you'll change your dress to fit that culture immediately. So, to run through a couple of quick examples, um, like Greeks use the same um, Mediterranean DNA as most Italians, but Italians here will have their own more Western clothing, while um, while Greeks have their own. So physically they'll look similar, but you've got different clothing. I previously made a tutorial about genetics and ethnicities. That one was pretty long. That's not essential for this. I do note in this tutorial that there are a couple similarities in defining the clothing for characters versus defining their genes. Um, but again, that's not essential. But this one, like that one, will be at a kind of intermediate level of modding. It's going to assume that you know basics of how to set up a mod and all that. So starting out, every culture has a clothing GFX set defined within the culture files in Crusader Kings. So in game, common, culture, cultures, and each culture, if we look at Central Germanic here, you can see here clothing GFX defined. DDE, HRE clothing GFX, and Western clothing GFX. So this, you can have multiple in here, but this is the order that it pulls it from. So it'll look at the first GFX and use that to define things. But if you don't have that because it's from a DLC you don't have, or if there's something in that GFX file that isn't defined, then it will try to pull from the next one in the list, which in this case is Western Clothing GFX. Um, and so as long as it's named under Clothing GFX here, as long as there's a name that's written under a cultural file, that means that that clothing GFX exists in the game. There's not a separate file where we list out the clothing GFX like we do here for cultures. Um, there are multiple other files that reference this GFX, and that defines how this GFX gets used. But once it's defined here, then that's the first step. Now, there's a lot of code that assumes that your GFX will follow the naming convention, name, in this case DDEHRE or Western, but underscore clothing underscore GFX. So if you create a new one, you should stick with the name underscore clothing underscore GFX. So now, once you have a clothing GFX defined, the first files that'll reference it are the trigger files. And these define scenarios when your character will be expected to wear certain clothing. So these are all defined in the common scripted triggers, 0 clothing triggers. Oh, I just want to specify that, um, again, I'm not going to exactly go fully into what triggers are. I know there's a couple of tutorials like on the Paradox wikis. Um, but basically how they work are they check to see if certain conditions are met, and then they can let other conditions apply. But anyway, the first triggers that will help define a character's appearance are the cultural triggers. Start here with this portrait shared clothing contents trigger. Um, so I think in the game as it was originally released, this would only apply. Basically, it would only apply the um, the cultural, the clothing GFX style if you were of that certain culture. But when the ability to adopt foreign clothing was introduced in royal court, it would trigger it would trigger that foreign court's graphical culture if your court had adopted that style. Um, if the trigger here works by checking to see if the top liege has adopted another cultural style, then it'll take that cultural style and define that flag as the cultural flag. Then there's this second option here for an individual has adopted a cultural style, um, and it checks to see what that is. It does mention has variable years as Varangian, so it might be only for Varangians adopting Greek clothing. But then otherwise, this applies if your culture scope, which usually will refer to culture, has a clothing GFX that equals culture flag clothing GFX. Um, and so then the game will fill in this value between the dollar signs. It'll define that as culture flag because then this variable can be used again, but that way you don't have to define every single different culture flag itself. But anyway, it reads that, so it looks to see how um, if the culture has clothing GFX, um, culture flag clothing GFX. Basically, it says, okay, well, it has a culture flag that's DDEHRE clothing GFX. So DDEHRE gets defined as the culture flag. But that is why I said you want to follow the naming convention of culture flag clothing GFX. Because if it doesn't, you could still technically write your own triggers, but if it follows that convention, then you don't have to add any of these additional triggers to actually make it work. Then if you just scroll down a bit, you have all the individual cultural triggers. Um, so this will apply for each cultural GFX if the culture scope, which is defined here as scope culture for the regular trigger, and then just culture for the spouse trigger. Um, I'm not sure what the difference is, if there is any, and why it's different for just having your own clothing versus basing something your clothing off what your spouse has. Um, but I think the scope culture should fairly work as um as culture. So um if you're as it was defined earlier, if your culture had the this culture scope, which in this case would be scope culture or just culture. So if your culture equals as clothing GFX, culture flag clothing GFX. In this case, if it's Byzantine or DDEHRE, whichever it is, that gets stored as the culture flag. So if your culture flag is Byzantine, then the portrait Byzantine clothing trigger activates and it keeps culture flag as Byzantine. So now the game needs to know which culture your character has. Uh, it needs to look up based on their social class which clothing set it should pick. So if we look down at portrait commenter trigger here, that is if portrait culture input clothing trigger equals yes. So what we had just looked at was, for example, the portrait Byzantine clothing trigger. In this case, it checks to see if there's anything that fits that, and then it sees Byzantine fits, and so that stores that as the culture input. Um, so it preserves that there, so it knows which culture it's dealing with. But now again, it's checking for your class or whatever the character's class. So it needs the highest title to be less than a barony. It can't be like a living in a city like as a mayor because they'll dress fancier. You can't have a trigger to give yourself low nobles, high nobles, royalty, or imperial clothing. Um, And then there's a couple instances that can prevent the commoner clothing from triggering, um, such as having a relationship to another character who is higher than a baron. Um, you can be a courtier of a legitimist adventurer, so you're gonna dress fancier than the regular rabble. Um, and you if you have any noble roots that the common clothing won't work, or if you're the member of a council, a duke or higher, um, and then it won't work if the based on some stuff from the royal court. So if these conditions are applied, basically if you're unlanded, it'll look to apply the commoner trigger, and it'll store though which kind of clothing you have as the culture input, so that gets used again later. Um, so if we look here then at the commoner clothing trigger, that basically just checks to see what your class is, um, if you have the commoner trigger, um, and then it checks, it preserves the culture input that you had in here, and it checks to see if you're not supposed to wear armor. So if you're not supposed to wear armor, it'll just and you're a commoner, it's set to give you regular commoner non-armor clothes. Now, and then if we just want to look real quick to wear no armor trigger, there is here. Basically, that means you don't have one of these triggers that'll give you armor. And this is a whole thing where if you're like a mercenary, a holy order adventurer, if you've got a position in the army, if you're a marshal, military governor, etc., or if you die in battle, like you're actually like your character's, um, like their portrait when they're dead, it's almost like their ghost is still wearing armor if they died in battle. Um, but basically, there's just a whole couple things here that define situationally whether your character should be wearing armor, and then if not, it just gives them regular clothes. But then looking back down here, we saw what the commoner trigger was. Then if we see low nobles, um, that will apply if your spouse isn't a duke or higher. Um, if you're a legitimist adventurer, um, if you don't have a high nobles, royalty, or imperial clothing trigger. And then the conditions where it does apply is if you have noble roots, um, and again, these all check to see what the culture input clothing trigger is. Um, so it still is holding on to that value for your culture. Um, it'll apply if you're counselor of a duke or higher. Um, if you're a courtier of a king, if you're a mayor, if you're a mercenary, if you're a legitimate landless adventurer, then if you do have a title, but it's a count or less, it'll give you the low nobility one. Um, and then also a couple different reasons if your spouse has it, or if you're a vizier of a county. And likewise, high noble clothing will apply if your highest title is at least a duchy. If you're a republic, um, a legitimist adventurer or spouse fits the bill. If you're a vizier of a duke or higher, or if you have a family member who's higher than a duke. Um, and again, like always, it keeps the cultural input. Then, generally by default, um, dukes and above should wear the same clothing, but what distinguishes between dukes, kings, and emperors is the headgear that gets worn. So again, there's some pretty similar conditions here about how high nobles headgear works. If you're a duke or above, uh, if you're a governor of at least a kingdom, or for spouses and viziers and family members of kings and emperors, then royalty would give you a crown if you're not a governor, but you are a king. Again, there's a different. This would originally just be if your title equals king, but all under heaven added conditions for that. But this triggers basically checks to see if you're a king, or if you're a spouse, or if you're a like a co-ruler. And then imperial is almost completely similar to that. Again, just checking if you're a ceremonial liege or emperor. Then there are a couple situational triggers, like for someone who's a beggar, who's a prisoner in the dungeon, someone who's sick. It'll change your clothing for that, or even if you're in the Crusades, like if you're a participant in a you're Christian and participant in a Great Holy War, it'll give you Crusader armor. And then you've got religious armor, or no, you've got religious clothing. Or if you're like a devoted, which means like a monk or a nun, if you're I religious head, etc. There's you can look through it here yourself, but there's just a whole bunch of different situations that are basically this is defined here. What is the situation in the clothing triggers? Or if you mod it, it can be any trigger file, but this is where it's kept all together. But just what are the situations when a character should be wearing this kind of clothing? That's how these are all defined. And it references the culture, the clothing GFX you defined through this culture input that is brought down from the other triggers, which I always check here based on the shared contents clothing trigger, um, checking to see what the GFX is. So now, um, in order to see the file that actually, um, based on these conditions that were set in the clothing triggers, to see the file that actually sets the clothing for characters, we need to go to GFX, portraits, portrait modifiers, um, and then these here list several of the main portrait modifiers. So we start out looking at closed base. So if we start out by looking at Westerners, DNA here will be modified by adding clothes. And it follows the template listed that's Western common or closed. I'll get into this list in a minute. Um, but the weight here defines the chance of it happening. Starts out weighted at 0. And then a weight of 20 is added if the character has the portrait, common, or clothing trigger. And as we went over, that means that the character has been determined to be a commoner and they don't have to wear armor. Then it stores the culture input in there. So, um, if that is activated and the culture input, which was stored and carried over, is equal to Western, then that'll add that modifier. So it'll be a total weight of 20 being applied in the condition already determined in the trigger. Technically, you could add something super specific, like adding in all the conditions itself rather than the trigger here. But that's kind of the point of the trigger, is it condenses it all into one thing that'll work most everything else. Then if you see here, there can be more situations. Um, so if you have the proper expansion pack, um, the Western actually gets disabled itself, and then it adds the it adds different eras that pop up, for the different time periods, and that happens if the triggers are applied to change the era. And then, it's got it for the different classes, those different eras. And then it has this for every culture. Then if you look back into the portrait modifiers folder, you can see there are a few different clothes, headgear, cloaks, etc. Um, there's a couple ones they specify if it's a developer or a historical character. Um, then you can see they add on different ones for religious, sickness, um, and then armor, and then certain situational settings and special ones. So it kind of works each of these as a priority for this close effect, but then you can have different ones set, and those all basically will just have a trigger for there and then apply that effect. One thing that you want to consider that I just realized is that for the portrait modifiers, um, you have the different files. Each of these has a slightly different name, like close base versus close armor. Um, and sometimes your characters fit the requirements for a couple different um, clothing sets at once, and that'll add the weight. But again, if it's fulfilling multiple, it the weights are all there, and it'll pick between the weighted different ones. But with the priority here, um, if it's a higher priority, that means if it fits anything in a higher priority, it'll completely ignore any weights from lower priorities and just base it off of that. So I know that between closed base is 1, 2 is like historical characters that are specified, 3 is priests, um, 4 is armor. So armor has a priority 4. So if it's like a historical character, they're gonna have their own specified things rather than the base clothes. But if they get turned into a priest, or if they put on armor, that's still going to apply after that. You want the armor to apply without weighting it compared to all the others. And then you also want armor to be able to apply to priests. Actually, though, if you look at the armor here, um, you can see that there is a low nobles armor set, uh, and a high nobles armor set. Um, and for each of these, the template um, would define it. It's usually going to have war nobility low and war nobility high, but um, that fits in within the template. But if you want to pull out a singular item within that list, which I'll be getting into in it, you can add this accessory, and instead of picking something from the list here, it'll go with one specific one. And then this also ends up for low nobles. There are separate triggers for commoners versus low nobles. And they would just use the low noble armor, and then the high nobles have their own armor. But for most of these, despite there being two separate triggers for commoner and low nobles, they use the same low nobles. But you can set it to be completely separate. I think as of right now, yes. The only difference is Kanti. Um, there's a separate war commoner, war low nobles, and war high nobles. But again, that's something that you can mod in if you so please. So now, if we want to find the listing of the clothing, which is the thing you probably would want to edit the most, you can go into common, jeans, and these here are all set as accessories. So you have hairstyles, beards, clothings. Again, in my other video, talked about the morph jeans. But again, even though morph genes are separate than special genes, since that morph genes are inherited and special genes are situational based on your culture and your position, they're all defined as genes in the gene folder. So if we open up closed gene here, um, it starts with most clothes, which includes um, the list of basically all the clothes in the game for males and for females. And then those are all the clothes that are possible for that sex. Um, and then boys are set to male and girls are set to female, meaning it'll just copy whatever was set up earlier. I think the only real spot where it's different is for the no clothes situation. Men and women will be set as nude, but it does give a bedchamber children for boys and girls. Um, but I think other than that, it's always going to be the same. But you could set it so that in regular situations, children wear different clothes for adults if you so inclined. So then there are several lists in here. Each of these are marked with an index number that's just consecutively. Um, and then it lists for the males and females what is available to each of them, and boys male, girls female. And so, we have these clothing sets for Western commoners, Western low nobility, Western high nobility, Western royalty, imperial, war nobility. And then, like I mentioned on these armor GFX portrait modifiers, it does choose, but it often will choose one of these specific lists. So low nobles here picks low nobles. Um, So that's what's available. But you could, if you did set it to that, it would have it could pick from one of these lists. And so the numbers here in front are the weighting, kind of like on the morph genes, which are showing the chances of having your gene value within a certain level. This is weighted. It's the chance of each option happening is its number divided by the sum of the numbers. So each of these has a 2 out of 7 chance of happening, except the last one has a half of that, so 1 out of 7. So then likewise, if we look at hair, this is here in the hairstyles.txt, and it's pretty similar to clothes. So I forgot to mention, but both of these, you have it set up as special genes, accessory genes, and then you have the hairstyles, and then the several options that are available. Um, so again, with the all hairstyles, it lists them all out. No hairstyles, it mentions bald, and here, you can actually set female to male. Um, Usually that's not, it doesn't work well because they're not meant to work with both, but bald is just an absence of a hair model, so that doesn't affect anything. So I mentioned in the other video on genes that each character has a kind of genetic hairstyle, where the chance of getting straight, wavy, curly, or afro or depends on your, it's assigned based on your ethnicity, and it can get inherited from your parents. So then in these lists, you see that you get different hairstyles for each hair type in each graphical culture, and these are also weighted. So if we look back at the portrait modifiers folder, we can pull out O1 hairstyles base, which applies certain modifiers. And so then if we look at Western straight, starts out with an initial weight of 0, but then it gets 55 added to if they have straight hair or a straight hair with thin beard, uh, and they have the Western clothing portrait trigger, and then that will apply something from the Western hairstyle straight. So it picks one of these hairstyles and gives it to your character. Now, if you remember, for the clothes, the trigger here would usually reference uh, a trigger that combines culture, class, and war or peace status. For the hair, it just references the culture because any character can have a certain hairstyle regardless of what they're doing or what their rank is. The game doesn't have hair upper class or lower class hairstyles the way it does for clothing or headgear. But again, in this list here, basically it says that okay, Western characters with genetically straight hair will have all these, wavy hair will have all these, curly hair, or afro hair, um, it's got these types, and because and sometimes if the hair type is rare in that culture, it will pick something that doesn't really fit with that culture in itself, but just because that hair type would be rare in that culture, it just goes with one of the other ones. Like that obviously exists for uh, characters with afro textured hair um, in other cultures, but likewise, if we If we look at steppe characters, um, there are the standard like nomadic hairstyles with like the mohawk and the long loops and tails and stuff. Um, but they're never steppe nomads are pretty much never going to get genetically curly hair. So if they do, they just get this uh, Middle Eastern style curly hair. And then likewise with culturally sub-Saharan African characters um, with non-Afro textured hair, there's a variety of different hair types that aren't really none of them are really common in that culture, so it just picks a couple different ones. Then you can see beards here work pretty similarly. And it's got these all listed. It's got the options available for each culture, except there are basically just two beard styles, straight and curly. Looking at this in here, you can see that the straight beards list will get applied if you have if you have straight hair or wavy hair get applied, but the curly beard type can get applied if you have wavy hair or if you have curly hair. And that modifier gets applied, just uh if you have the appropriate culture and your cultural clothing GFX and the hair type. But a modifier does get added if you're a Muslim to increase chance that you always have a beard. Or actually if you have Amishi culture, but just because of a religious or cultural prohibition on shaving. And then there are a couple of negative modifiers for scripted appearance or ruler designer. So it won't apply a beard on you if you didn't pick it in ruler designer. Then thin beards work if you have any character um, that just has a thin beard. It doesn't have a portrait trigger because if you actually look at the thin beards, um, thin beard straight here, there's only two. It's a kind of and they're kind of like step style. So just it doesn't matter what what culture or clothing GFX you have, it'll always just apply the same thin beards. And it does add a couple modifiers to actually make this less common if you're Chinese or if you're Malay or Southeast Asian. And then likewise, this also works for Afro hair texture. There's no cultural and it'll just apply one of these African style beards if you have that hairstyle, regardless of your graphical culture. Headgear here is pretty similar to clothes. Again, list them all. Then you have, and for each set, you have what you have for men and women, but you have these chances here empty. You have to give a chance that they don't have any hats. So you have common, nobility, high nobility, royalty, imperial, war, and stealth for each culture. And then you have religious clothing as well, depending on the religion and the rank. And looking in the portrait modifiers, then if you look at what triggers each of these, you can see that commoners gets applied. Um, if there's a commoner headgear fallback trigger, which usually means something like they're a peasant leader or something, and even if they have a higher rank, they'll default back to wearing commoner clothing. And that actually increases the modifier, but then there's still a modifier applied if they just have the commoner clothing trigger. Um, then you've got the heiress too, but then with low nobles, and then this gets applied, have low nobles clothing, high nobles headgear gets applied. You have the high nobles headgear trigger, which is different than the clothes. It's a bit more specific, but because while like dukes and kings and emperors will have the same clothes, you have separate triggers for royal crowns and imperial crown. Then all of these work pretty similarly for miscellaneous things like, well, which in here would be listed under miscellaneous genes, but then portrait modifiers, these are separate. Got cloaks, props, etc. So I went ahead and made a custom GFX, which I call coolclothing.gfx. So I've gone ahead and added it into Central Germanic. For most German cultures, I've added it for the DDEHRE clothing. Um, so then you need to set the triggers, and you just in your mod folder in common scripted triggers, you just need to set a couple of triggers that follow the format, because in the main triggers, clothing triggers file, these are the only ones that specifically reference the culture in particular. If you add it with the correct format of your name underscore clothing underscore GFX, and then you add in that name, your portrait, that name clothing trigger, and that name clothing spouse trigger, and then you set the culture flag here equal to that name, then everything else should work. Again, you can add other triggers if you want to add specific scenarios, but if you just want to add clothing GFX that works normal, those are the only triggers that you need to add. Then when you add the portrait modifiers, um, like how I mentioned earlier, how you have like level 1 is the regular clothes, level 4 is the armor. Um, you can add in another one, um, or you could just uh, go through here. You could make a copy of the one closed base and add it in here under closed base, and it would kind of behave like that. But because if you have a file here that mentions the same closed base, then it'll ignore everything that's in the original folder and it'll only apply what's in here. But if you add a different one here, like I'm adding close cool instead of the priority equal to 1, it'll consider it separately from what it's considering closed base, but it's at the same priority level. Then like how everything else works, uh, you add it here. So we just made a copy for commoners, low nobles, and high nobles. Then for the armor, because it's actually a higher priority, I can actually just add it in here. I'm going to close armor cool and add a priority of 4, and then set here um, what they're going to wear um, in war situations. But then with these, if you're adding in something from a template here, it needs to be in the same gene as the rest, which usually means you need to make a copy the original special accessories clothes and add it in where you want. This at the end here, adding it on the index. Um, and which means it if you've got multiple of these, they can conflict with each other unless you add like a compatibility patch that includes all of the default ones, or if it's even like a total conversion mod and it doesn't have the default ones, but includes all the ones that are either in the default or not. So if there's two mods where it's got all these listed, and sometimes it'll list the same ones, you would just need to make a compatibility patch that you load later that includes all of the clothes sets you want um, added on together with the same index, because it's pulling from this gene that equals clothes. Um, that's how it's set there. You can't split potential values of a gene between two different files. Now you could do a separate gene where you also reference these and you have that in a different file. But what that means is it gives it a new slot, which means that if you if I say got rid of everything else except cool and changes to close cool, it would actually add it, but because these models are set up to appear on the head, it wouldn't replace the standard close. So it'd like overlap on the other one. So you would need to program it so that your characters don't ever have any clothes actually applied, and then it's got this cool clothes applied instead that replaces it, but it's just easier probably to make a copy of original uh, clothes or hair or headgear, whichever it is, and just add that on. So now looking at how I went and applied this in here, cool high nobility clothes. I I added in secular sub-Saharan to high. Check that out. Yep, African high 2. Then for headgear, for Imperial, I added the Byzantine headgear. Got the Byzantine crown, and then for female, I've got secular Indian royalty. If you look here, you can see that that's actually what she's wearing. Then you can also see here she's high nobility, so she's got um, Indian nobility too. But here, got Chinese royal and Southeast Asian royal. Uh, Here he's got P1, so that's like that's northern. Okay, this is the Middle Eastern nobility. I and so right, the Indian, Southeast Asian, and Middle Eastern is there. Then you've got Chinese, Sub-Saharan, um, kind of lower nobility. I've also got these defined here. I think this is the Eastern, and she's wearing Byzantine. He, I think, is wearing Byzantine. He's wearing Indian. Step. and then Western nobility, low, Chinese, and I've set the hats too. Um, set the male commoners here to be naked. As far as female commoners here, I think this is the steppe religious there. Right, so then we've also got African I and this is that's uh, Catholic voted. Right, it's the same as what it's when he. But see, then I haven't overwritten anything of any of the religious clothing, so. But I also did redefine the custom armor. So if we look here at this guy here, right now he's lowborn, but because he's in our court, he's wearing low nobility clothing. But if we go ahead and recruit him to the court, he should. Well, I guess he's not one of the best, but if I force him to be a knight there, now he's wearing the low nobility armor, which I have defined in here as the Templar, but then high nobility armor is up in here with my Marshal, who's a Duke, and I guess Margrave, whatever. But he's got the Indian Royal armor. Oh, one last thing. So this isn't a tutorial on how to make custom assets. If you want to use some assets from another mod in your clothing GFX, make sure you have permission and give credit, of course. But what you need to do to get those assets into your mod are as such. You could either load that mod as well, and as long as it's earlier in your load order, you could just reference those assets. Or if we take a quick look here, there's a couple things you copy over, or store them this way if you make them yourself. So I'm gonna copy a Mesoamerican Jaguar helmet that's in Age of the Fifth Sun. I'm not sure if it was originally made for that one, but that's where I got it. Um, and so then if we look in GFX models, portraits, attachments, and then I think usually this gets organized by sex and slot. Or there's different ways you can, but somewhere within here, you want to have a folder that contains all the assets here. So that asset file here um, will say it's getting used. It'll reference a mesh file that should be in there, and it'll reference diffuse, normal, and specular image files that should be in there. And then if it's clothing, it should have blend shapes as well. Um, then at the end here, you have the name of the entity here. Um, and then again, this would all be in a tutorial for making these assets. So if you're copying it, it should all be in here already. Just make sure you copy it like that. And then to make sure it actually shows up in the game, you need to go to GFX, Portraits, Accessories, and then you can have text files here called whatever. Um, that again, you can copy this information from the mod it came from, but it'll have the name here of the asset. Well, I should be clear here of the helmet itself, because again, it's not exactly the same as the asset file. But you have its name, then you have some set tags so it recognizes it as a helmet, and then it won't show hair. Um, and then you reference the entity name, which is again what it was set here. So then the game recognizes it as a helmet, or headgear that can be used. And then in headgear, if you want to add that in your genes list, it's like anything else you can. So if we look here in game, I've went ahead and ported this, and yeah, it's being well, a bit of clipping in the ear, but other than that, it's looking pretty good. It matches, and I haven't loaded the original mod that it came from. So there's a lot you can get out of that. Um, and again, if you want to learn how to use Blender, there seem to be some tutorials online to figure teach you how to do that. But with with what's available in game, I mean, obviously what we have here doesn't make that much sense. Um, but with what you have in game, and along with all the assets that have been put together by a lot of dedicated community members, there's a lot that you can do if you want to set up um, clothing type for just a custom culture, take advantage of what's there, or if you want to like if you're merging a culture and you want to have a different variety of outfits, you can do that too. Um, but yeah, but let me know if there's anything major I got wrong. But hopefully that's helpful, and thanks for watching.